In chapter 3.6, we're going to pick up with changes in equilibrium. In other words, we're going to start off from our original equilibrium that we've managed to develop in the chapter 3.5 lectures, and then see what happens to that equilibrium as conditions in the market change. In this particular case, we're going to do a demand shift. But before we do the shift, let's start off with our original supply and demand. This was the one from our previous lecture where we finally figured out that at a $20 price, tutors and students would come into balance where we would get an equilibrium price, which came about, remember, from the intersection of this demand curve and this supply curve. They intersect right at that point, and the intersection means that at that particular point we have a common spot on both the green demand curve and the blue supply curve are that dot at the same time, which means that at $20 both consumers and suppliers want to do this amount of quantity, which looks like about what, 40 maybe, or 30. This particular quantity is equilibrium quantity. But that was assuming a certain level of income, a certain number of tutors in the market. All those things were taken for granted, and we were simply trying to find how that equilibrium got established. But what if conditions changed? What if the demand curve shifted from this green dotted one to this solid green one? So this means what? Demand has increased. Let's go back and remember from several slides ago, we worked through what the determinants of demand were. And remember, by determinants we mean anything other than the price, because the price only controls the quantity demanded, but we're talking now about shifting the entire demand curve. Remember, one of those things was income. Does everyone agree that if students were significantly wealthier, a lot of students would say, oh, a $20 tutor, yeah, I can afford that. I think I'd like to do that. A lot more students would like to have a tutor if they had higher incomes. But since incomes for students are generally low, we generally find that students don't hire a lot of tutors. So my point, of course, is that the demand curve for tutors could shift dramatically farther out so that at every possible point, no matter what the price was, we would now find there's more people wanting to hire a tutor. Now, what does this do for the market? Well, as we can see, the original $20 price is nowhere near equilibrium anymore. It used to be the equilibrium, but clearly $20 does not reach the E2 point. What price is necessary for that to happen? Well, we need a $30 price. Well, how did the price move from $20 up to $30? Well, on the previous slide, we were able to determine how that happens. It happens automatically because in the short run, a temporary shortage would develop, correct? With all these much wealthier students consuming way out here, but only having this many tutors at $20, there'd be a shortage of tutors. So what would immediately happen is prices would start to rise, and as prices rose, two things would happen. Even among the wealthier students, some of them would decide, no, I can figure this out of a book myself. I'm not willing to spend 30 bucks. Even though I make more money, I'm not willing to spend it on tutoring. I'd rather spend it on beer and pizza, or whatever it is that students want to buy. So some students would cut back on the number of tutors they're asking for, and simultaneously at a higher wage, more people would agree to be tutors. So eventually a new equilibrium at E2 is developed. So here's our final point on this issue. Markets automatically adjust whenever supply and demand conditions change. In this example, an increase in demand triggered a higher price. As the price went up, more tutors came into the market until eventually that shortage was eliminated as the extra tutors come into the market, and buyers and sellers are now at balance at the new equilibrium E2 instead of the original equilibrium E1. Now let's do the same thing for a supply curve shift. Only this one we're going to make a negative shift or a reduction in supply. Now remember, when the entire supply curve moves, it means something other than a price of that item changed. Because we do recognize that if prices go down, fewer people want to work in that business, but that's moving from one dot to another dot on the same curve. So what causes an entire curve to shift? Those were the determinants of supply. And if you go back and review that section, you remember that the determinants of supply included things such as the price of factors of production, changes in the number of firms that are in the market, changes in technology. There's a whole bunch of different things that would cause an entire supply curve to shift. Okay, so let's go ahead and figure out what, I'm going to make one of these up. Let's assume, hopefully it doesn't happen. What if we had another 9/11 style terrorist attack in the United States? Well, that'd be a horrible thing, right? But I think we can all predict very, very rapidly that all the foreign students in the United States would now have a significantly larger amount of scrutiny on them than was before. So let's just assume that this is what happens. Major terrorist attack, the FBI kicks into gear and starts stopping all foreign graduate students from working in the United States until they're vetted to find out whether they're part of some terrorist ring or not. Now, of course, the vast majority of people are not, but the government would probably stop all foreign students from either entering the United States or working in the United States until they were able to vet them all. So, what just happened to the number of foreign graduate students in the United States? It would shift to the left. As you all probably know, foreign graduate students make up a huge amount of the supply of tutors and other kinds of people who want to work in academics. If you look at the number of professors we have, both at Mercer, at Kennesaw State, at Georgia Tech, who are foreign born, we have a large number of professors. So if something stops the number of professors or graduate students who are permitted to be in the United States, then we would suspect that the supply of tutors would shift to the left. Now, shifting to the left means at any given wage, there's fewer tutors available. So what's that going to do? Cause a surplus or shortage of tutors? Well, I think it's pretty obvious now there's going to be a huge shortage, right? There's lots of students trying to hire a tutor, but now because of the 9/11 disaster, we now have a huge reduction in tutors. So how does the market react? Well, if there's a shortage in anything, what happens to the price? Well, in this case, the price would naturally go up, wouldn't it? It started at $20, but now students are scrambling to find a tutor, wages are starting to rise, and two things simultaneously happen. Remember, originally we had this many students trying to hire a tutor when it was $20. Now there's way fewer students, or rather way fewer tutors available. So as the wage rises now to $30, some of those students will decide, you know, I don't think I want a tutor after all. I think I'll try to figure this out on my own. And so the quantity demanded would fall from roughly 35 or 40 down to only 25 students who want to hire a tutor. So even though there's way fewer tutors in the United States due to another 9/11 style tragedy, would there be a balance of supply and demand? Yes, but only at a much higher price. At a price of $30, anyone willing to pay $30 an hour will now find a tutor, even though there's far fewer tutors, because a whole bunch of other students have now dropped out of the market and are no longer trying to hire a tutor, and so we're now back in balance. So I've come up with just two off-the-cuff examples to illustrate why a demand curve might shift or why a supply curve might shift. And they can shift in either direction. Supply curves can shift to the right with an increase, such as an increase in technology, or they can shift to the left, as we just described. The same thing is also true for demand. Demand, as we showed in the previous slide, increased because of an increase in income, but it could also decrease due to a decrease in income, or one of the other factors that control the determinants. So in the real world, we recognize that there's lots of shifts. Demand and supply curves are constantly shifting because conditions are constantly shifting. So whenever you see a price change, one or more of these shifts must have occurred. Either the demand curve shifted or the supply curve shifted in some direction that would cause the market equilibrium price to move from one equilibrium price to a different equilibrium price. So let's take a look at what those would be. Let's start with the first one here on our list, a rightward shift of demand. A rightward shift was the one we illustrated. That would be an increase in demand. In that case, it was because of an increase in income. What effect does that have on the prices? As we saw, an increase in demand will ultimately increase prices because otherwise there would be a shortage, and shortages naturally disappear as the price rises. But take a look also what happens to quantity. At the higher price, how do suppliers respond? Now that there's more money to be made in tutoring, more tutors decide to go into business as tutors, and therefore we have an increase in the quantity. So we solve the shortage of tutors because of the increase in income of students by having a higher price, which lures more tutors into the tutoring business. But what if you had a leftward shift of demand? A leftward shift is a decrease in demand. And that could take place because of what? Let's say there is a decline in income. We'll just continue with the same example. There's a decline in income. And because of a decline in income, far fewer students are trying to hire a tutor. How does that affect the price? Well, obviously at that point, there's going to be more tutors than there are students. So what does that do to the price? It decreases the price. And of course, at the lower price, how many people still want to be tutors? Well, some of them decide, I'm getting out of this business, I'm going to go do something else. And therefore, we would have a decrease in the quantity. How about a rightward shift of supply? What causes that? Well, a rightward shift is an increase in supply. That can happen because of what? One of the factors of production got cheaper. It could be because there's an increase in technology, making it easier to produce the good. There could be an increase in the number of suppliers in the market. Let's do tutoring for Spanish. Given the number of immigrants coming into the United States who are Spanish speakers, the number of tutors that could teach Spanish, because the person's a native Spanish speaker, has increased dramatically. What would you expect to happen? A surplus or shortage of Spanish teachers? Well, there'd be a surplus of them, right? And as the surplus happens, what would that do to price? We can see right here, it would push the price down. And as the price went down, of course, more people would say, hey, now I can afford a tutor. So that would increase the quantity. So the final market equilibrium price would be a lower price with more people getting tutors. And then last but not least, the example we actually did, a leftward shift of supply, which is called a decrease in supply. The example we had was a terrible terrorist incident that caused the government to crack down on the number of foreign graduate students in the country. So that would cause now a shortage of people who are capable of being tutors, and that would cause a price increase because we have a shortage now. What would happen with quantities? Of course, with the shortage, as the price goes up, fewer students want to hire a tutor, and therefore the ultimate number of quantity of both tutors being tutors and students looking for a tutor both go down until they reach the new equilibrium. So our final point on all this is, in a market system without any government involvement whatsoever, we still get markets constantly readjusting to whatever conditions take place out in the real world as people react to the higher prices or lower prices that these conditions trigger. Now realigns the market in a new equilibrium. So this brings us now to our question about market outcomes. Remember, we talked earlier about the market mechanism affecting what will we produce, how will we produce it, and for whom are we going to produce the goods. Let's now try to answer that question using the knowledge that we're going to be using a market mechanism. So the first question, what will we produce? Well, the goods and services that get produced are determined in markets when the goods are desired and are profitable. And that should make perfect sense to everybody. The demand curve, the desire to buy those goods, is what gives firms the desire to produce those goods. So let's think about a particular example. How many electric cars will be sold in the United States? Well, in a market system, the answer to that question will be, it depends on how people feel about electric cars. Right now, electric cars, while environmentalists would like everybody to have an electric car, the reality is the vast majority of people still don't want an electric car. There are still issues dealing with range and the ability to get the car recharged quickly that make an electric car not particularly useful for long distance trips. And in a country the size of the United States, where people do lots of driving trips, like driving to Florida for Disney World, if you were on the road, and I actually saw this the last time I went down with my family to Disney World, we stopped at one of the turnpike rest stops, and there was a bunch of Teslas there getting recharged. And all the Tesla owners were standing around out in the hot sun waiting for their car to recharge. We pulled up to the gas pump. I was refueled in about 3 minutes, and those Tesla people were standing out there for over an hour. That did not make me want to get a Tesla for any long distance driving. So we recognize that markets do not produce goods because, for instance, environmentalists want it. They produce goods because the customer wants it. And the customer wants it for whatever their reasons are. Firms simply produce the goods people want. Issue number 2, how do they produce it? Well, profit-seeking businesses strive to produce goods the most efficient way. Now, why do they do that? Is that because they're nice guys and they just want to do the right thing? Well, of course not. If you aren't productive, that means your costs are high. If your costs are high, your profits will be low. We already know that business people are profit-seeking. That's what satisfies their self-interest. So just like you want to get a good deal at what you're doing, business people want to save money on costs. So they work really, really hard at being efficient, hiring the right engineers, hiring the right MBAs, for instance, who know how to make the system or the company operate efficiently. Because the more efficient you are, the higher your profits will be. So in market systems, all producers struggle to keep costs under control and therefore are efficient. And then last but not least, for whom? Who will the goods go to? Well, they go to those who are both willing and able to purchase them. So we ask the question, who gets a nice new Tesla? Well, let's assume that you are a serious environmentalist, but you don't have a really good job. You're too busy hiking the Appalachian Trail on a regular basis, whatever it is, and so you tend to work only part-time, and you don't have enough money to buy a Tesla. So even though you have a tremendous desire to have a Tesla rather than a gas-burning car, you won't get one because you didn't come up with whatever amount of money. I think for a Model S was $80,000, $90,000, $100,000, some large dollar amount. The poor environmentalist would not have it. So the point I want you to recognize is goods are not given to people because they quote unquote deserve them. They go to the people willing to pay for them. And who is willing to pay for them? Those people who have incomes. And then where do you get your income? By supplying whatever your talents are to the market. So it turns out that that's where we get our circular flow diagram from that we had done in a previous slide. Now, sometimes governments step in and impose price controls. We were describing a situation in which the market determines the price by letting customers and suppliers interact with each other and then just letting the price either float higher in order to eliminate shortages or drop lower in order to eliminate shortages. But what if a government stepped in and imposed some arbitrary price? And by arbitrary, we mean not determined by the government, but rather not determined by a market, but determined by some government official. So there's two possibilities here. The government can impose a legally imposed maximum price called a price ceiling, or they can impose a legal minimum price called a price floor. Either case, the market will not reach equilibrium. Let's go through an example. Let's assume that the government sets a price ceiling. And let's come up with a practical example because there's some major discussion of this going on in California right now. Right now, rents in Silicon Valley are sky high. And in San Francisco as well. It's not unusual for an ordinary house, we're talking a little 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, maybe 1,700 square foot with a 1-car garage, in Silicon Valley will rent for $3,500 or more per month. Individual apartments of 800-900 square feet in the city of San Francisco rent for $3,000 to $4,000 a month or more. So there's a lot of upset people who are upset with the price. So let's take a look at this. Let's assume that you're in Silicon Valley and right now equilibrium price to rent a house is $4,000. So the government says, no, we don't want that to be true. We want that number to be much lower. Let's set the price at $2,000. Or some other arbitrary price, as long as it's not the equilibrium price. Now, the government believes it's doing a good thing. And to the person, let's work our way through, and then we'll try to make a decision whether imposing the price ceiling will be a good thing. The price ceiling will be this horizontal line. In other words, it's a ceiling which prevents anything from going up any higher. So picture in your mind a ceiling. If you had a helium balloon from like a kid's party, and you let go of the balloon, it would rise until it hit the ceiling. And the ceiling would prevent it from rising any further. That's the mnemonic I use to memorize what a price ceiling is. So remember, the price ceiling is set below, here's the equilibrium, the price ceiling is set below the equilibrium. But look what happens when you set the equilibrium down there. So you've got a bunch of Google engineers all making 6-figure incomes. They all want a house. They see the $2,000 price and say, wow, yes, I'd like to rent that. That's nothing for someone in my income group. 2,000 bucks is not bad. So how many people want to demand the house? That's way out here on the demand curve. So here's the quantity demanded, okay? Unfortunately, what happens to the number of people who want to be landlords now that the rents have been pushed down from 4,000 down to 2,000? Well, obviously, we could search through all the different dots on the supply curve. Here we are now. Here's the supply. So now we have a quantity supplied way short over here. We have a quantity demand way large over here. What does that trigger? Well, of course, we see it right here on the screen. It triggers a shortage, just like we described in previous slides. So herein lies one of the big takeaways, also referred to as the law of unintended consequences that economists have come up with. The law of unintended consequences says that whenever a law is passed, there is usually a negative consequence that also arises that the lawmakers weren't thinking about. It was unintended. What's the unintended consequence here? Remember, what's the goal of the price ceiling? Pushing the price down is supposed to help people, right? Makes houses and apartments cheaper. But at the same time, it triggers a shortage. Do shortages of housing make people better off? Of course not. This means now you are an engineer just graduating from college, you're hired by Google, you go to Silicon Valley, will you be able to find a house at any price? No, because even though the prices are legally $2,000, they've all been snatched up, and very few landlords, and certainly no one new wants to build a house, and therefore there's a massive shortage. How long will this shortage last? Well, essentially last indefinitely, because as long as the price is below the equilibrium, there are fewer suppliers supplying housing than there are demanders. So this is one of the major problems of price ceilings, is the triggering of shortages. Remember, the price got to be where it is up here at the equilibrium, which in Silicon Valley is ridiculously high. I'm not disagreeing about that. The problem is the number of demanders, in other words, people trying to move to Silicon Valley with large incomes, is larger than the number of houses in existence in Silicon Valley. The real problem in California is the draconian zoning laws and also the building permit laws and all the kinds of ways that California tries to slow down or stop new development has made it virtually impossible for housing to keep up with the number of people in California. So California in many areas is just the most obvious and most dramatic in Silicon Valley and in San Francisco. There are more people trying to live there than there is housing, and of course the government is using a ham-handed approach to try to solve the problem. But instead of solving the problem, it merely shifts the problem from being a high price problem to being a shortage problem. But the problem still exists. People cannot get a hold of housing in Silicon Valley. So, next point, how about a price floor? Let's do the exact opposite situation. Now the government imposes a minimum price. So now, as you can see, graphically, we're going to draw a horizontal line at the price floor. Remember, the market equilibrium price would be way down here, and now it's set up here by law, whereas the market would set it over here. Let's think about an example of what this could be. How about milk price supports, which have existed in the United States in many areas? This this program gets started way back in the Great Depression, where the government is trying to protect dairy farmers by putting a minimum price that farmers are allowed to sell milk at, because during the Depression, the demand dropped out like a stone because people's income went down so dramatically that the prices of milk had fallen down to a market equilibrium. Now, of course, there's no need for this anymore. I mean, we've been out of the Depression for over 70 years. I mean, actually 90 years now. This whole idea that this market interference should exist is ridiculous, but it still exists. So now we have this price floor. So the price floor is designed to keep prices above the equilibrium level. Now, who's that a benefit for? The consumer or the producer? Well, clearly the producer, right? I don't think anyone feels that higher prices for the same item is good for a consumer, but it's certainly good for a producer. So the dairy farmers are in favor of having the price floor. Unfortunately, it causes a major problem. As we can see on the slide, it triggers a surplus. Why does it do that? Because let's take a look at the high price floor. Do people still want to buy the same amount of milk as they used to at the equilibrium price? Well, of course not. At the higher price, we can see the quantity demanded goes from the equilibrium level down now to this level, because that's the price where it hits the demand curve. So fewer people buy milk at the higher price. Simultaneously, what happens to the number of cows that dairy farmers want to keep on their dairy farm? Well, the farmers see this price and they're thinking, wow, I can make a fortune selling this milk. I want to increase the size of my herds. So total production rises all the way out to this dot on the supply curve, giving us this quantity supplied. Does anyone see a problem here when the supply is way up here, but the quantity demanded is this low? Well, of course, here's the answer. We have a surplus, right? So we have a whole bunch of unsold milk. So producers are producing milk for which they cannot find buyers. And so the government buys it up, has the milk destroyed. This is a total waste of resources. The market would find the proper equilibrium if we simply leave people alone. The market price would fall until we reach the equilibrium, and then the number of milk drinkers would increase to the equilibrium. The number of dairy farmers would decrease until we're at exactly the level where dairy drinkers want to be. So my point, of course, is that these market interferences by government, when they believe they're trying to do a good thing, oftentimes backfires because of that law of unintended consequences. They haven't thought their way through the entire issue. Until you study supply and demand, it's very, very easy to make this kind of mistake. This is almost like being a novice in chess, and you make a move with one of your pawns or one of your bishops or whatever particular character you're going to be, or piece you're going to be moving, without realizing that there's going to be a counter move by somebody else. And then you think you're making a brilliant move, and it turns out all you did was expose yourself to an attack and a checkmate by the opposite side. So as an analogy, I just want you to think about that as when government officials interfere in the market, they're very much like naive chess players who only believe their move is the important move, without realizing that the customers and suppliers are both going to change their behavior once the price has been changed. So that all needs to be taken into account.